So I'll start off with just a little bit of going through the idea of debt from our perspective, which is both Pan-African and feminist. Have a conversation of a little bit of the more technical and what we see, and then have a conversation with Nambuso about how cultural imagination, recreation, reclamation looks like in these conversations of things that are many a time perceived as overly technical, but really are just, framework that governs how we live our life, in what way we live our life, and the quality that we live our life. So when it comes to borrowing, it's, we all know it's one way for governments to increase their resources and so potentially make resourcing available for gender equality and women's rights. Dina Musindarwezo has written quite a bit on this. Her last paper on debt is called Realizing Women's Rights, the Role of Public Debt in Africa, and I can make available a reading list of all the things that we make reference to here later. She outlines how public debt and its servicing are a particular problem for the African continent, undermining the ability of governments to meet their commitments on gender equality and the promotion of women's rights. The costs of servicing this debt are disproportionately borne by women, while the funds borrowed are rarely spent in ways that prioritize women's rights. In Africa, we know that doesn't work that way, and in fact, there's been a cause of violence on the lives of African women instead of making sure that this money is spent on them. Busi Sibeko, who wrote for the very first AFCOD conference 2 years ago, pushes this idea in her paper that a feminist reading of Africa's indebtedness requires that we take into account how debt has led to a policy externalization, which is really characterized by neoliberal policies, which have undermined the role of states in provisioning the basic goods and services needed to reproduce our societies. And so the current debt architecture, as we know it, and I know Jason and his team will speak to this on day 3, in a global economic extractive order that is racist, that is sexist, and that is colonial in nature and continues to carry a coloniality pattern with it. It's really not designed to build, but instead it's designed to extract and to continue to feed a system that has always needed subsidy. And that subsidy has always come from the global south, and for us, from Africa, from our resources, from our land, from our labor, and it's really the bodies of African women that continue to carry a lot of this burden, even if we're left out of the conversation. We see this clearly through the clear thread that is carried from our country's external debt right through to household debt levels. And a lot of time, this household debt burden is carried by women. This linking of an external debt and household debt is one that is ignored many a time, and it's in its place, big words and jargon of seemingly complex reasoning is fronted. But African feminists continue to ask, who should be in these conversations on debt? What vocabulary is used? And is it resistance to bring to light this link and breathe light to the violence the system places on Africa, her citizens, and especially women? You see, the debt architecture from the credit rating agencies to the World Bank and the IMF have ensured that African states are in a perpetual, consistent, and constant state of debt. Coupled with that, Tandika Mukindawire calls the Africa failure complex, this narrative that the African state is incapable of providing for her citizens. And not only are we trapped in this debt cycle, but we need technical assistance, as we saw in Ghana this year, with the US announcing technical assistance for economic issues for Ghana. It's almost as if we're in this recurring nightmare of debt. We know to tackle debt, it requires, as Busi explains it, a recognition of how, in the absence of state provisioning, the debt burdens have been transferred to households, with women, again, disproportionately bearing the cost. With austerity measures from debt, usually the first things that are on the chopping block are those things that women need in terms of service provisioning, maternal health care, education for their children. Well, it should be for everyone's children, but usually it's women who carry that burden. And we also know the financialization of life is a new frontier of debt. With the rise of the World Bank's cascade approach that introduces foreign private finance to roll out what should be public service and accrues as an added debt, which rarely gets characterized, understood, and included in conversations about debt. But who sets priorities for what gets invested in, again, is based on neoliberal priorities rather than people-centered priorities. So if a maternal unit is not deemed profitable, it gets no investment, and instead the system will prioritize things like mega infrastructure. And we see it in Nairobi with a PPP that built the expressway that so few of us enjoy, and only 1% of us can afford to use because of the high toll fees. It costs about 700 shillings back and forth, which is, way more than anybody can afford. Mm-hmm. So the debt question is inextricably linked to the question that Radhika Balakrishnan, a feminist economist, asks: what is this economy for? And for the first time, at least in my conscious memory, my own country, Kenya, this year didn't pay government staff because they prioritized debt serving payments instead. Questioning what the economy and this debt is for, away from the jargon that seems complex, I think is resistance itself. Strip it away from all of that and we'll see that back to a racist, patriarchal, extractive system that is unfair and that's completely unjust. And part of this resistance is continuously to go back to history, as Kanyasila did with us this morning, to continuously show how white capitalist domination and violence continues era after era, not to forget it. Ghana this year, or is it recently, went through their 17th IMF program. Zambia similarly has had 14 programs before. I've spoken about this repeatedly. And for Zambia, the centerpiece of the deal is that IMF is targeting, in their words, a large front-loaded and sustained fiscal consolidation. Specifically, they want the fiscal deficit to decline by 6% of GDP in 2021 to a surplus of 3.2% of GDP by 2025. And this is really largely to be achieved by a drastic cut in government spending over the period 2022 to 2025. So basically, the IMF wants our governments to reduce expenditure in the billions of dollars between now and 2025. And this is a definition of austerity. And so the general formula, and Aphrodite, the experts on this, goes like this. First, countries go into short-term balance of payment debts because of their lack of capital. Much of it is stolen during colonial periods and their reliance upon borrowing to conduct often expensive capital improvements in their countries, and which some of are in the raw material extraction sector, thereby operating as a subsidy for mining companies. Then the IMF arrives and informs the finance ministers that government spending for education, for healthcare, and other social development projects must be cut in order to prioritize payments to the wealthy bondholders. And then third, to pay the debt servicing on these loans, our countries cut their government spending and thereby impoverishing our people further and exporting more of our cheapened raw materials rather than more profitable finished products. And we continue to be a commodity-reliant export countries. And when countries start to export more and more primary commodities, this produces a price war that leads to a steep decline in revenues gained from volume of exports. And then fourth, with weakened revenues from imports, our countries must continue to cut social spending, ramp up our sales of raw materials and public assets, borrow more money from external and private sources just to pay off the interest in their ever-ballooning debt. And so the imperative of exchange rate stability prevents governments in our poor countries from exercising any effective monetary policy, which includes capital controls. While our fiscal policy is already eviscerated by balanced budget demands from the IMF, again, social spending cuts, pressure from wealthy bondholders to reform, and that is, our tax policies, as we can see in Kenya. And as part of this cycle, the World Bank then comes in with what they call, which I referenced to, the cascade approach. And it's important to remember that we cannot speak about debt without including a narrative of reparations and reparative justice. And so with the cascade approach, really what the World Bank is saying as our countries are going through these violent cycles of debt is that we have private solutions for your public problems. You have a problem with healthcare, we have a private financing solution for you. Private finance is hardly ever local private finance, it's usually multinational private finance, again linked to IFFs, and the same organizations, the same multinationals that are bleeding our countries through, dodging tax legislation are the same ones that are touted as silver bullets to come and save us from ourselves. So you change your policies, you change your legislations. The next point is because Africa is very risky, you need to de-risk their investment, and that comes at a cost. How these projects get picked, again, the prioritization of what gets picked has questions around it. Bottom line is always profit, and so the needs of the actual people of the country are never front and center for these decision making. It'll largely be mega infrastructure. It'll be mega infrastructure geared to get out, to extract. There's conversations about the AFCFTA and conversations about, and I spoke about this at AFCOD, we've started trading under the AFCFTA, and Siatini knows better, but the first case of success was Kenya sending batteries or selling batteries to Ghana. It took 3 months for them to leave from Kenya to Ghana, went through Singapore before they got to Ghana. And this shows that we have no infrastructure, and the World Bank is on hand to now say we're ready to come with private financing for you. The EU is changing the developmental model, looking at mega infrastructure as their angle of coming into the continent, building our roads, making sure that we have the 3 million trucks that we will need to bring to life the AFCFTA. So we're opening up all of these for private finance to take over. But women's rights organizations are constantly saying that these neoliberal policies that are centered on reducing fiscal deficits are able to pass off savings from public spending cuts by transferring costs to households, and that is to women who are forced to fill in these gaps really left by the state. The world then shifts to privatization of services, what the World Bank calls the cascade approach, and the same private sector, which is a source of illicit financial flows to the tune of $89 billion, according to UNCTAD's latest figures. So the question around the state is one that also comes up quite frequently as we push these narratives. From where we sit at NAWI, we're Pan-African, we have conversations at global and Pan-African levels. The question of pushing back against this idea that the African state is incapable of providing for her own, is incapable of running our affairs, running our economies, and needs the World Bank, needs the IMF, needs externalized debt in the way that is structured right now to be able to survive. But that tension is also held when you speak to local level organizations where the state is actually, and we've had this conversation with conversations about what our presidents look like, what our governments and economic frameworks look like, where the state is the biggest source of violence on its people. For women as well is the biggest source of violence on women and women's bodies. And how do you balance these? Lino Some is the director of social research at the University of Makerere, puts it that what we do need to fight for is a decolonized formulation of our state, and that decolonized version of the state is what we need to center. And so holding those two in the same time as having a conversation around debt and the autonomy, the sovereignty of our states is something that I think is worth a conversation. But underpinning all of that is a conversation of what holds all these things together. And for that, I'll pass on to Nombuso, because really at the heart of it is a cultural hegemony in question that dictates how we see the world, how we see our economy, and the threads that pull all of that together.
Thank you, Chris.